In Amuoi, night usually ended gently. People slept knowing that dawn would come when it was ready. There was no hurry. The village had lived this way for generations. Crickets sang without interruption. Palm leaves rustled softly in the dark. The air carried the smell of firewood and earth. Then, on a night that should have been ordinary, a sound arrived before light. A single drum beat. Not loud, not fast, not angry, just firm enough to wake thought before sleep could settle again. Some people turned on their mats and listened. Others sat upright, confused. A few whispered to themselves, not in fear, but in disbelief. The drumbeat came again, slow, measured. By the time the sound stopped, night no longer felt complete. In Amuoi, drums were never decoration. They were not played for nothing. They were not beaten by accident. They announced meetings. They warned of danger. People knew something was wrong, because everyone knew. Drums never speak without reason. At the village square, elders gathered as they always did. Palm wine was poured. Greetings were exchanged. Small jokes were made. When the drum was mentioned, an elder waved his hand dismissively. Nothing serious, he said, but his voice lacked confidence. Ikiru had learned to listen carefully. Widowhood teaches that skill. When you lose a husband, you learn that the world speaks quietly before it changes. She woke before sunrise every day, but that morning, routine felt thin. The drumbeat followed her thoughts like an echo. 2 nights later, the drum came again. Same time, same rhythm. This time, fewer people slept through it. Dogs barked briefly, then stopped. Roosters crowed too early, confused by the disturbance. By morning, Amuoi was tired, not from labor, but from waiting. Arguments began over ordinary matters. A borrowed hoe, a farming boundary, a late greeting. None of these issues were new, but voices rose faster than before. Tempers shortened. People were tense not because of the arguments, but because something unspoken pressed on everyone. Sleep became unreliable. People lay on their mats listening, not to sounds, but to absence of them. Every rustle of palm leaves felt suspicious. Morning arrived, but it brought no relief, because everyone knew the night would come again. For Nkiru, the restlessness stirred something deeper. Late one night, while sitting alone near the dying candlelight, her husband's voice low and careful. He had spoken once about land, about how meetings were held quietly, about how some families signed papers they did not fully understand. At the time, Nkiru had brushed it aside. She had believed the elders would handle it. Now, the memory refused to fade. The next morning, Nkiru started asking people questions. Not directly, just gently. Do you remember that land sale from years ago? She asked. People avoided her eyes. Some laughed nervously. Some changed the subject entirely. That was when Nkiru understood it wasn't ignorance but avoidance. Days passed without drums, but instead of relief, tension grew. People waited. Waiting exhausted the village more than noise ever could. Men sat longer in the shade. Amuoi was awake but unsettled. When the drum returned it was expected. Still, it startled everyone. A single beat, firm, not angry. Just enough to remind the village that whatever has begun was not finished. By morning, arguments had doubled. Fear no longer hid behind patience. The morning after the drum returned, Amuoi no longer whispered the way it used to. People spoke quietly, but yes, open. At the well, women paused longer than necessary, their hands resting on buckets as they exchanged looks before words. At the paths between compounds, men stopped pretending to be busy. They stood in small clusters, speaking in low voices, glancing around as though the village itself were listening. The questions were the same everywhere. Why now? Why before dawn? Who wants us awake this badly? No one answered directly, but something had shifted. Silence was no longer comfortable. The next morning, men sat under trees staring. Women forgot small tasks and stood holding brooms without sweeping. The villagers were worried, and they didn't know what was wrong, because the elders haven't spoken up yet. Kira noticed how people moved differently, how conversations ended abruptly when someone approached, how elders laughed louder than usual, as though laughter could erase tension. She noticed how people often looked towards the old community hall, without realizing they were doing it. The place had been forgotten for years. Now, it had returned to thought. One afternoon, Nkiru asked an old man she trusted, not directly, just gently, did the land issues of years ago truly end? The man did not answer immediately. He looked away first. Then he sighed. Some matters end on papers, he said, but not in people. That was all. But it was enough. The next drum beat came earlier than expected. Just before dawn, the sound moved through Amuoi faster than ever. By morning, everyone was awake. That day, Arguments erupted everywhere. Two men nearly fought over a narrow footpath. A woman accused another of withholding water. A farmer shouted at his own brother over crops that have always been shared. These were not new problems, but patience had thinned. People were tired, not of work, but uncertainty. That night, Ikiru could not lie still. She waited, not for sleep, but for direction. When the drum sounded again, she rose quietly, wrapped her shawl, and stepped outside. She did not tell her children. She followed the sound slowly, carefully. The drum led her away from familiar paths, past sleeping compounds, past abandoned spaces. The air smelled of damp earth and old wood. The sound grew clearer. The building stood silently, just as it had for years. Mud walls cracked. This was where decisions were once spoken openly. Now it stood unused, except tonight. From the shadows, Ikiru saw them. Young men, not strangers, sons of the village. Their faces were serious, focused. This was not rebellion, it was intentional. The young man did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He did not threaten. He simply spoke. "We waited," he said quietly. "We followed the proper way." He explained how letters were written, how meetings were requested, how promises were made and never kept. As he spoke, Ikiru realized something painful. This was not anger. It was exhaustion. They were never meant to cause trouble, the young man said. They were meant to remind. The drums were not rebellion. They were not disrespect. They were a refusal to disappear quietly. Ikiru listened, without interrupting. For the first time, the sound of the drums made sense. By the time Ikiru returned home, the sky had begun to pale. Her children were still asleep. She sat down slowly, her thoughts heavier than her body. She understood now why people moved differently, why they avoided certain places, why they looked towards the old community hall. Without realizing it, the village had been carrying something unresolved. By the next morning, Umyue felt unfamiliar, not because of anything had changed on the surface, but because pretending had become exhausting. People no longer hurried past one another. They no longer filled silence with jokes. They stopped, they looked, they listened. At the well, women spoke openly while drawing water. Their voices were still low, but they were no longer careful in the way they once were. They spoke as people who had reached the end of patience. On the paths between compounds, men paused mid-step, turning their heads at the sound of approaching footsteps, as though expecting news. Even when no one was coming, something long buried had begun to rise, not loudly, but steadily, and everyone felt it. For years, people had referred to it indirectly. That matter, that time, that issue. Now, the words were spoken clearly. The land, not whispered, not softened, just said, the community land. That had been sold quietly. Years ago, the land was meant to serve everyone. The land whose sale had been explained as necessary, temporary, harmless. Families who had lost their farm spoke openly for the first time, not angrily, not accusingly, just honestly. They spoke of promises made and never fulfilled, and as they spoke, others listened, some with shame, some with surprise, some with the quiet relief of finally hearing the truth spoken aloud. The elders felt the shift before anyone else. They had ruled Umyue, not by force, but by authority, earned through tradition and silence. Silence had always protected them. Now, silence worked against them. People no longer waited for permission to ask questions. They asked directly. They asked publicly. An elder attempted to laugh it off. One afternoon at the square, drinking his cup of palm wine, and joking about restless youth. No one laughed with him. That was when he stopped smiling. For the first time, the elders understood that control was slipping, not violently, but irreversibly. Ikiru did not speak loudly. She did not stand at the center of conversations. She watched how elders avoided eye contact when certain names were mentioned. She watched how younger men stood straighter when they spoke. She watched how women, once quick to hush another, now allow conversations to continue. She noticed how often people glanced towards the old community hall. Even in daylight, the building had become a symbol without anyone naming it as such. It stood as a reminder of when decisions were once made openly, and of how far the village had drifted from that openness. That night, the drums did not come. No beat before dawn, no sound cutting through sleep. Instead, the village lay awake in silence. People waited, not for noise, but for meaning. Dogs slept uneasily. Roosters stared without crowing. Sleep came in fragments, and when dawn arrived, it brought no relief. Silence now felt deliberate. By mid-morning, people began moving towards the same place, without being summoned. Under the old trees, near the square, no one announced the gathering. No one organized it. People came, because waiting had become unbearable. Men stood in clusters. Women sat forward, alert. Young people stood without being told to sit. The elders arrived last. They knew why they were there. The land issue was raised plainly. Names were spoken. Dates recalled. Agreements questioned. An elder tried to explain. We feared division, he said carefully. The words hung in the air. A woman stood slowly and replied, her voice steady. Silence divided us more. No one interrupted her. Another elder spoke. We did what we thought was best. At the time, a man replied from the crowd. What was best for whom? The questions were not angry. They were overdue. What followed was not chaos. It was confession. Some elders admitted fear. Fear of conflict. Fear of losing respect. Fear of being questioned. Others admitted convenience. One admitted silence. I knew it was wrong, he said quietly, but I thought time would bury it. Time had done the opposite. Time had sharpened it. Justice did not arrive dramatically. No one was dragged away. No voices were raised. Instead, steps were agreed upon. Land records would be reopened. Families would be acknowledged openly. Compensation would be discussed, not privately, but in front of everyone. Committees were formed, with names spoken aloud. Timelines were sent openly. Nothing was rushed, but nothing was hidden. For the first time in years, Umyoi felt honest. The following morning, a single drumbeat sounded. Just one. Birds took over announcing the morning. People woke and looked at one another. They understood. The drums had finished speaking. Life did not return to normal immediately. Some sounds were too deep for that, but sleep returned. Arguments softened. Routine regained its rhythm. People spoke sooner now. They asked questions earlier. Silence was no longer trusted blindly. One evening, Hiru sat inside her room, the lantern flickering softly beside her. She thought of her husband, of how he had once spoken about the land issue quietly and carefully, of how she had told him to let the elders handle it. She understood now. Not all silence is patience. Some silence is surrender, and some silence must be disturbed. After the drums stopped, Umyoi did not celebrate. There was no sudden joy, no singing, no gathering to mark an ending. Instead, there was something quieter. Adjustment. People had grown used to tension. They had learned to live with it, breathe around it, shape their days around it. Now, without it, the village had to learn how to exist again, and learning took time. Peace did not arrive gently. For some, it was uncomfortable. Men who had benefited from silence now walked carefully, unsure of where they stood. Families who had spoken out carried both relief and fear. Relief that they were heard, fear that openness had consequences. At the market, conversations paused when certain people approached. At the well, eyes met longer than before. Truth had been spoken, but trust had not yet caught up. In the weeks that followed, the village began the slow work of remembering honestly. Meetings were held, not under pressure, not in the dark, but in daylight. Old records were brought out, notices were rewritten, agreements were read aloud. For the first time in years, people listened, without assuming the end. Some memories were painful. Some people cried quietly, as names of lost farms were mentioned. Others sat stiffly, hearing their own silence described aloud by someone else. No one interrupted. For Nkiru, the days felt heavier than the nights had been. She continued her routine, opening her shop, feeding her children, sweeping her compound, but something inside her had shifted. She realized she had survived, not just widowhood, but erasure. She had watched truth nearly disappeared once. She would not let it happen again. Children noticed the changes before adults began to talk about them. They asked why meetings happened more often now, why elders explained decisions instead of simply announcing them, why adults listened longer before responding. Parents answered carefully. They did not speak of drums first. They spoke of listening. The young men who beat the drums returned quietly to their lives. No one praised them publicly. No one accused them. They went back to farming, trading, repairing tools, but people watched them differently now, not as troublemakers, but as reminders. Months passed. The tension loosened. Arguments still happened because people were human, but they ended faster. People spoke earlier. They no longer waited for frustration to build before saying something. Fear, once the loudest presence in Umyoi, slowly lost its authority. One evening, Ikiru was asked to speak at a small meeting. She almost refused. She was not an elder. She held no title, but she stood, and she said only this: "We waited too long once. We should not wait like that again." No one argued. The abandoned community hall was cleaned, not rebuilt grandly, not renamed, just reopened. Notices were pinned again. Meetings were held there openly. It did not erase the past, but it acknowledged it. Nights returned to being quiet, not the tense quiet of waiting, but the ordinary quiet of rest. Crickets sang without interruption. Dogs slept without stirring. Roosters waited for light instead of confusion, and when people slept, they slept fully. Amuoi did not become perfect. No village ever does, but it learned something essential: that silence can protect lies, that waiting can be a form of fear, and that truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives patiently. Years later, the story was told to newcomers, not as a legend, as a reminder. They were told, "There was a time when a village waited too long to speak, and the sound that woke us came before dawn." And so, in Amuoi, people learned to listen, to one another, to discomfort, to truth, because they understood something now. The drums did not change the village. The courage to listen did, and that was enough. Peace asked more of Amuoi than conflict ever had. When there had been tension, people knew where to stand. When there had been silence, people knew what to avoid. But peace demanded participation. It required people to speak even when it was uncomfortable, to listen even when they were tired, and to remember even when forgetting would have been easier. In the weeks after the drums ended, Amuoi learned this slowly. Change did not announce itself. It showed up in small ways. A man stopped a disagreement before it grew. A woman asked a question during a meeting instead of whispering later. An elder explained a decision instead of expecting obedience. None of these moments were dramatic, but together they reshaped the village. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some elders missed the quiet authority they once held. Some villagers missed the comfort of silence, where responsibility could be avoided. There were moments when old habits tried to return. Meetings delayed, explanations shortened, decisions rushed. Each time, someone spoke up, not angrily, firmly, and each time, the habit retreated. Here never became a leader. She did not seek it, but people noticed her presence. When discussions became tense, eyes often turned toward her not because she had answers, but because she listened without flinching. She carried the weight of witness. She remembered what silence had cost, and she refused to forget it. The drums were never played again, but they were not forgotten. Children learned their meaning not as sound, but as story. They learned that the drums were not instruments of fear, but of insistence, that they did not demand destruction. They demanded attention. The old community hall became busy once more, not crowded, not chaotic, just used. Meetings happened there in daylight. Announcements were posted clearly. Decisions were recorded and read aloud. The building did not regain its former pride. It gained something better: trust. Truth stopped being an event. It became a habit. People no longer waited until problems grew heavy. They spoke earlier. They corrected one another gently. Mistakes still happened, but they were addressed before they hardened. One evening, Kiru sat outside her home as the sun lowered itself behind the trees. Children laughed somewhere nearby. Cooking fires sent thin lines of smoke into the sky. She thought of her husband, of how he had once spoken quietly about injustice, and sure if his words mattered, they had mattered. Even delayed truth mattered. Amuoi did not become a story told with pride. It became a story told with care. Visitors were told. This village learned the hard way that peace without truth is fragile. No one exaggerated. No one embellished. The truth was strong enough on its own. Years later, dawn arrived as it always had. Without drums, without warning, without fear. People woke, worked, spoke, and rested. And that ordinary rhythm was the true ending, because the greatest change Amuoi made was not.
For 15 years, no one asked about my sister.